Well, thank you so much for tuning in to Morning Live. Now, businessman Duduzane Zuma appeared at the state capture inquiry yesterday to clarify some of the allegations leveled against him. Now, Zuma has been implicated by several witnesses who've accused him of doing the bidding for the controversial Gupta family. And he's admitted to having convened a meeting with former Deputy Finance Minister Mcebisi Jonas and driving him to the Gupta residence. But he denied that Jonas was offered a sum of 600 million rand as alleged by Jonas. And Zuma, who is of course the son of former President Jacob Zuma, has also denied meeting former Free State Economic Development MEC Mxolisi Dukwana and the province's former Premier Ace Magashule. SABC journalist Manqoba Mchunu is here to discuss this, and also with us here this morning, Justin Ramages, political and legal analyst and attorney from TGR Attorneys. Thanks so much to both of you for coming through.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with you, Manqoba. Firstly, some of the more salient points that were raised by Duduzane Zuma yesterday.
Well, Sakina, of course, there were some concessions that were made, which are basically, points of facts. Those are points that could not be disputed, and they are called common cause facts. And that's where we started yesterday, with the evidence leader painting those common cause facts. Of course, the fact that Mcebisi Jonas was taken to the Gupta compound by Duduzane Zuma, which he agrees to, and the fact that they took transport in one car, Duduzane Zuma's car, when they went there. But what is in dispute, or some of the issues that are in dispute, firstly is the issue that Mcebisi Jonas did not know where he was going, as he claims in his statement, and secondly, the content of that meeting and who was at that meeting. So the issue there being the fact that, did he know that he was going to the Gupta compound? He says he didn't know, but Duduzane maintains that he knew, he was informed, there were text messages sent to him, and secondly, the content. Mcebisi Jonas claims that there was a 600 million rand bribe offered to him and a position of finance minister if he would work with the Guptas. But of course, Duduzane Zuma says that is not true. I was simply taking him because there was a rumor that was there at the time, and we wanted him to actually talk about that rumor with Fana Hlongwane. And thirdly, there's evidence from, himself, Duduzane Zuma, that Rajesh Tony Gupta, had peeped into the room, and that none of the Gupta brothers were part of that meeting. That meeting was between Fana Hlongwane and Mcebisi Jonas. But of course, there is contradictory evidence from Fana Hlongwane himself when he made submissions to the public protector saying that none of the Gupta brothers had peeped in that meeting, that Rajesh didn't peep. So there are some contradictions, but Duduzane, of course, maintaining that he doesn't know anything about a bribe and a bribe that was offered, and simply saying that, or in other words, saying that it's not true. The evidence leader asking, of course, are you sure? Why would Mcebisi Jonas fabricate such a lie against you? And he says, I don't want to be drawn into speculation.
So both the evidence leader, Mokoena, and the chairperson trying, of course, to dig down a little deeper into that, because it became an interesting question of whether Mcebisi Jonas actually knew why he was going there, and one starts asking all sorts of questions of yourself in this instance, like if someone said to you, we're going somewhere, or we're getting into my car, would you not ask the question as to where are we going? So this again raises very interesting questions about evidence, the evidence that's being led, how it is being tested. Justin, your take on that?
I like this version. I like the version you put to me, because we have a situation where Zuma doesn't really know the previous Deputy Minister of Finance. So if I'm unfamiliar with you and you invite me to get into a car to broker a meeting, it's very rare that I won't be asked where am I going, especially if the original meeting's at the Hyatt. I think I'd like to touch on to what my colleague has said in this regard. There's a very cosmetic delivery of evidence. This is my position. As soon as I start to test it, because it's an investigation, you'd like to ventilate, you'd like to tease out the points, you'd like to look at the evidence, because you just have an auditorical articulation of what his view is. But now we see, once these versions of Jonas is being tested, Zuma is being tested, we see, listen, there's inconsistencies. We need to know, what is the rationality for meeting? What was the true purpose of the meeting? And here we have a lack of evidence in that regard. Why are you there? And I guess nobody's going to write an email saying, please come to the Gupta mansion to discuss your appointment as Minister of Finance. It seems unlikely. But what we want to do is, what is the most probable scenario? What is more likely? what does reason and logic dictate? And if you string all the evidence together, what do we have?
And then just to be clear, from the onset it was pointed out that Duduzane was appearing not because, he was subpoenaed or anything,
sure.
but maybe that is a point worth clarifying, Manqoba, from the onset.
Indeed, and you'll recall that, he's been implicated by several witnesses, and so he has to come and basically give his side of the story, what happened. And of course we expect him to dispute some of those testimonies that have been there, as it did yesterday. Of course he disputed several of them. So really he also, what I saw and observed yesterday during the testimony is that, at some points he tried to poke holes in some of those testimonies, the testimony of Mcebisi Jonas, the testimony of Johan Boysen, and his lawyer even going as far as saying that if it's in the case of Johan Boysen, who says that Duduzane took him to the Gupta compound, of course it does concede that I did take him, but it was not for what, he says we went there for. It was just on a social basis. He was inquisitive about going to the Gupta compound to see the Gupta. So he says that this emanated from an issue that Duduzane had been a co-complainant in regarding some online betting scam. So his lawyer is saying that if at all we can prove that you were not the co-complainant, which you deny at this point, this means that, there will be some questions surrounding the testimony of Johan Boysen. Equally, the testimony of Mxolisi Dukwana again claims that Duduzane wanted to benefit from Jagersfontein mining, and again his lawyer is raising this issue to say, if that can be proven, did you actually benefit? And he says no, if that can be proven, and even in fact challenging the commission to actually dig deep into these allegations and look to actually see whether there is some motive behind these testimonies that were given. So in effect, just to question the credibility, so to speak, of that particular evidence that's been given by those two witnesses.
And that's very interesting, because this is where we find ourselves now, where you had previous versions, being put on the table, and now suddenly you're starting to question, did it not? Because he categorically refutes that he actually met with Dukwana and Ace Magashule.
Sure, and that's interesting. I like the Commission's rules. It says, look, if there's an instance where a witness is going to be giving testimony against you, you have the opportunity to respond, and you can submit an application to cross-examine this witness. And now they've invited him to give his testimony. And one version always seems right until you hear the other version, and this other version pokes into to the supporting documentation and evidence that is required to put that version, to test the veracity of that version. And now we're left with a sense of bewilderment. Who is correct? Which shouldn't be the position. If these allegations are made and it's made on auditorical evidence, please support it by appropriate facts. That's what Zuma is asking for, and I think that's fair. If you're looking for a fair engagement and it's investigative in its nature, please put forward appropriate evidence that puts me in that scope where I'm actually guilty of participating in some commercial nefarious activity.
But where does the burden of proof lie now? Or does it lie anywhere with anyone? Because you now have two conflicting sets of testimony.
Sure.
The one says he was present, this took place. The other says, I was never there, I never met with these two guys.
So where it leaves us is the Commission actually has to instruct its investigators to obviously look at this information. So its function is an investigative forum, and it's got to instruct its investigators and tell them, listen, look at this evidence, collect it, aggregate it, collate it, and put a version. So once I make findings and recommendations, I can decide, is this correct? Are we going to push this forward? Or look, is the Achilles heel in this testimony, and do we actually have to look at the narrative that's going on? Because look, there's been a lot of people throwing around this idea that there's political agendas influencing the delivery of evidence. So we can't take that out of the domain. So it makes it interesting for where our country is going, and also where it leaves justice.
One of the interesting questions that emerged, of course, yesterday was when the Zuma was asked why he didn't lay a charge of defamation against Jonas for making these allegations. What did you make of that, Manqoba?
Well, of course, it's interesting. You have such serious allegations being made against you, and you claim that you are not involved. And the question here was to really test then why didn't you open a case? If, you face such serious allegations and you say, of course, you're not involved. So it really questions whether, as well, the veracity of, his evidence, his testimony before the commission, and whether or not, it should be believed. I mean, for such a serious matter, of course, one would consider that you will take some actions. But of course, Duduzane Zuma saying that I didn't take any action at the time. There were other options that were to consider. But he says, he dares the commission that, you can also investigate some of these, incidents yourself, some of these claims yourself. And he maintains, of course, that, at some point he was not given a chance to do so, even by the public protector, to give his side of the story. And he says he was simply placed in the crime scene at most of these incidents, whereas he was just, not involved. And he says in some of these meetings, they claim that he was more like a lampshade. So he says, there's lots of questions that are here, alluding to some extent to a conspiracy against him.
But that question still of why he didn't see it fit to then open a defamation case, if we push that to its logical conclusion, can that not be asked of everybody who's appeared before this commission, Justin?
Sure, it could be. But you, as the person who is the victim of, you've been defamed, you can elect whether to press your rights in a different forum, which you choose, or you can choose to handle it in a different forum. Obviously, there's scathing criticisms made against some individuals, and you have 3 years in which to exercise that right, until it prescribes. So there's ample opportunity. So if you'd like to push it, I'd let the information run, see where my rights are, decide how to push it, and decide where to exercise it. Also, But
why haven't they exercised it up until this point? Because these allegations are not new.
Which is a fair question. But I think we also have to look back at what he's doing. He's got a potential murder trial against him. He has to give his attention to that. He's got this business venture. He's got to respond to the State Capture Commission. He's got to brief lawyers. It takes a lot of time. So just because he hasn't exercised it as quickly as we'd like to, I don't think is indicative of anything else. I think if he decides to ventilate it in the public domain, in the State Capture Commission with appropriate evidence and supporting findings, let him do that. If he's found to be innocent, then he can push those rights. But in addition to that, I would prefer, if you're asking my preference, if someone says something negative about me, I'd like to address that in order to protect my integrity as a businessman, at least. I would have hoped that.
And as I said, that question doesn't only go for Duduzane Zuma, it goes for everybody else who've also, had allegations leveled against them. And I can't, is there anyone who's gone and charged anyone with anything as a result of what was revealed at this commission?
Well, not that I can recall. I don't know, Justin, if you can recall.
I'm also unable to recall anything now.
Yeah.
But isn't it interesting then? Because it kind of gives the impression that this is a kind of chess game where, people are playing to see, show me your hand and I'll then play my next card kind of situation.
And of course, Sakin, I mean, the real tough job then, lies with the commission chair, who has to, at the end of the day, collate all this evidence, who has to weigh this evidence. He has that unenviable task to determine really who is to be believed in this matter. I mean, he has alluded to the fact that there might need to be extra investigations that are carried out into this effect. But of course, I mean, the onus is on him at the end of the day. That's why even when he asked some of these questions, when, for example, to Duduzane asking, this question is not fair, he has to explain to him that, no, we have to ask your version so that at the end of the day, we want to really find a real picture of what happened and who's telling the truth or not. So the onus is on the judge. He's going to have to do that.
And in the end, was there anything new that was revealed?
I don't know if there's anything new that was revealed. I mean, they highlighted the 6 points of contention that they'd like to consider, but I think it's just Zuma giving a very cosmetic version of his events. I'd like to have seen something more meaningful, more meaty, such as an admission of who's involved in the gig, what's happening, is there really state corruption? What is your position? Is it really one of a facilitator or a independent lampshade sitting in a strange meeting environment where people get made strange offers every time? There's a history of these allegations by people who are in position of trust as towards the public, and have has produced at least some evidence of what you've committed. All I've seen from his side is a denial, challenging the evidence, but let's see some of your evidence.
But he's saying there's nothing untoward in him having a meeting at the Gupta residence, even though he was pressed on why he would choose that venue, seeing that he lives not a stone's throw away from there. Why didn't he use his own home? And he says he doesn't use his private residence for business purposes, and this was his preferred place to do business at. So he sees nothing wrong. He feels there's nothing untoward. What he did is things that people do all the time. Is that inconceivable? Is that not a plausible explanation?
Well, it's interesting, Sakina. I mean, why, you would go to the Gupta's residence and, where your house is just a few meters. And there was a question as well, why didn't you go to the Luthuli house? If all of you are comrades, why then didn't you go and find a place in Luthuli house? But of course he says, no, this is a place where we usually hold our meetings, This is where we usually meet with some business associate. But interestingly, the allegations that have been leveled against him is that he's the one that facilitated the meetings between cabinet members and the Gupta family. So obviously using his proximity with the Gupta family and the fact that his father was the president then. And the allegations are that at those meetings, this is where these different offers were made. In the case of Mcebisi Jonas, 600 million in a cabinet position. In the case of Mxolisi Dukwana, 200 million rand bribe. So the question really then is there, why then would you go to the Guptas? And why is Tony Rajesh Gupta always seemingly in these meetings, and why are these offers?
It's his home. Why wouldn't he be there? I mean, if we're being logical about it, it's his home.
Sure.
Why shouldn't he be there? If you're coming to my house, it's not a surprise that I'm there. It's my house. But I guess it raises all of these very pertinent questions. Fana Hlongwane. And Fana Hlongwane is a name that we've seen before,
sure.
In other dealings that have been heavily criticized. So his name comes up as well, very strategically every time, and perhaps rather notoriously as well. So, you have all of this. But in the end, again, one has to ask the question, have we moved anywhere? Has this helped the commission in any way? Because it seems as though it was just, refuting what was put on the table.
Is that for me, or is it an open
You can
question?
take it.
I think where we are is a nice place to be. We have some form of hard ground under us, as in what is Jonas's position, what is Zuma's position. And I think we're at an appropriate place where people should start collecting appropriate evidence to see where we are as a nation. Because I would like, as a personal private citizen, to see justice being done in these instances. And what I'd like to be done on hard evidence and appropriate evidence, not wild allegations thrown against each other in a public domain where information gets ventilated and nobody comes to a positive conclusion. What I want is a positive conclusion backed by positive facts and evidence, and to the extent that it's not, idle evidence to fill in the gaps, so we have a appropriate picture of where we are as a country. And just to add on to what my brother was saying, what I don't understand with this meeting is, why is Duduzane always there to mediate the tensions between these two parties that have a conflict with each other? Why? And the second question, what is the appropriate place to have such a meeting? I would think it's at your house.
Well, he claims that he has a good heart. He has a good
He was comfortable there.
And he loves to resolve conflicts. So that's what he claims at the commission. And of course, that was his claim. But I think, Sakina, interestingly, I think the public also, for the first time, I think, getting to hear from Duduzane Zuma on some of these serious allegations. I mean, we've heard the versions of Mcebisi Jonas and the likes, and Duduzane Zuma is never really in a public platform, so to speak, to come and ventilate and give his side of the story. So for me, it's more about, hearing what he has to say. And then, I mean, people make up their minds, but I think based on facts and based on the evidence that's there, the commission will then make relevant findings in these issues.
In the final analysis, though, Duduzane and his role, ventilated here. We're hearing his side of the story. But we have to ask questions of our leaders, being called into these meetings and their actions post that. Because what does it say? When the whole Waterkloof landing issue surfaced,
Sure.
again, questions were asked about people attending a wedding. And why do our leaders act as if they have no agency, as if they have no power?
Sure, which is bizarre, because they're part of the cabinet. They have awesome power, if you really want to think about it and what their responsibility is. So it's highly suspicious, and for lack of a better word, that the previous Deputy Minister of Finance gets into a car to discuss a matter which he doesn't know, especially where he understands, what the nature of the relationship is. And you'd like to disclose it up front. Why am I going there? We'd like to get into these narratives, these two narratives you'd like to understand. But we also can't move away from the fact that there was duress and pressure from external forces on these ministers to behave in a particular way. And at that time, you might innocently be doing something or nefariously participating in something. We don't know what the surrounding circumstances are.
And it also begs the questions, what power really did the Guptas have? And, what influence did they have? Did their close proximity with the president somehow scare these ministers, or was there fear that surrounded them, and that's why many of them ended up going to the Guptas? So it raises very serious questions about the sort of power influence that the Guptas had as well.
And I guess these are the questions that still need to be answered. And, the level of accountability that we hold our leaders to as well, because we need to talk about the power that was wielded on all sides, by whom and to what extent. And again, I don't think we should let people off the hook. Nobody should get a free pass on this one. You should take responsibility for what you've done. Thanks so much to our guest this morning, our reporter here at the SABC, journalist Manqoba Mchunu, as well as Justin Ramages, a political and legal analyst and attorney from TGR Attorneys. With that, it's time for the news.